Good morning. Today is April 24th, but these last few days have felt a little bit more like Christmas season than it has spring. It's been cold, it's been dreary, and a few times throughout the week, I've even seen the white stuff accumulating on the ground. Well, it got me thinking about Christmas a little bit, and specifically, it got me thinking about this wonderful passage in the Gospel of John. This wonderful passage that really articulates the essence of what Christmas is all about. In John chapter 1, verse 14, John writes, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." Every once in a while, I love to read Eugene Peterson's translation, The Message. And in John 1:14, he translated as saying, "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood." This idea of moving into the neighborhood is an important idea, not only for understanding the incarnation, but for understanding what it means to follow Jesus. And that takes us to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Today, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is going to continue working through the Beatitudes, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And specifically, he's going to say, "Blessed are the merciful." It's important to understand what Bonhoeffer is doing with the Beatitudes. The way we treat the Beatitudes are a list of things to be achieved so that we might achieve or receive God's blessing. In other words, we want to strive to be merciful because then we can receive God's blessing. That's not the way Bonhoeffer viewed the Beatitudes. Bonhoeffer said there's no blessing in any of these things. Rather, the only blessing is found in following Jesus Christ. It's found in responding to the call to follow Jesus and be his disciple. The Beatitudes, then, are not something to be achieved. Rather, they are descriptions of people who have responded to the call to follow Jesus. Because when we respond to the call to follow Jesus, we renounce everything except Jesus. As you've been working through the devotionals this week, I assume that you've paid attention to that word renounce or renunciation. And so in the Beatitude for today, Bonhoeffer says, these people without possessions, these strangers, these powerless, these sinners, these followers of Jesus live with him now also in the renunciation of their own dignity, for they are merciful. Notice again, Bonhoeffer is not saying that Christians should strive to become merciful. Rather, Bonhoeffer says that is simply an aspect of following Jesus. Following Jesus is a renunciation of everything so that we might follow him and follow him alone. In this regard, it's being like Jesus. I think of Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, where Paul writes this wonderful hymn describing Jesus and what he has done. And Paul describes Jesus as being in the very nature of God, but did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he emptied himself. Rather, he set aside his own rights and privileges and took on the nature of a servant. Notice those two descriptions of Jesus. In John 1:14, he's described as one who moves into the neighborhood. In Philippians chapter 2, he's described as one who empties himself and takes on the nature of a servant for the benefit of others. That's very appropriate to the beatitude of being merciful, which is a renunciation of our own dignity. To say that another way, this call to follow Jesus and this call to be merciful because we've set aside everything except Jesus. This call to be merciful is to move into the neighborhood. It is to set aside our own rights, our own privileges, our own possessions, and even our own dignity for the sake of identifying with others for their benefit. That's what it means to be merciful. Eugene Peterson again translates this beatitude, "Blessed are those who care." In other words, Bonhoeffer would say, followers of Jesus Christ care. We see this in Bonhoeffer's life. He identified with the Jews in Germany. One of the things that drove him crazy about the German church is that they were buying into this theology that somehow the Aryan race was superior and that the Jews needed to be cast out of the German church and Germany itself. And so Bonhoeffer identifies with their plight. Notice what he says in our quote today. He says, disciples have an irresistible love for the lowly, the sick, for those who are in misery, for those who are demeaned and abased, for those who suffer injustice and are rejected. That was the Jews in Jesus' day. And Bonhoeffer says following Jesus is identifying with them. That's what kept Bonhoeffer in prison. I mentioned last week that Bonhoeffer had an opportunity to escape, but he was unwilling to do so because he thought his response to the call to follow Jesus was a response to the call to identify with the broken, the hurting. One of the movies that we've watched during our time in quarantine is End of the Spear. And End of the Spear is the story of those 5 missionaries, Nate Sate, Jim Elliott, and the others, who in the 1950s went down to Ecuador because they wanted to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Wadani people. And of course, we remember that they are speared to death by the Wadani people. And the movie End of the Spear portrays this very powerfully. But the movie continues with the story because it talks about the wives, and it talks about Rachel Saint, Steve Saint's aunt, Nate Saint's sister, who continue to minister to the Wadani people. Not only do they continue to minister to the Wadani people, they move in with the Wadani people. They serve them. They love them. They move into the neighborhood of this people who don't know Jesus Christ, these people who are so broken and sinful that they murdered their husbands and their dad. But Bonhoeffer continues. He says, people who respond to the call of Jesus seek out all those who have fallen into sin and guilt. No need is too great. No sin is too dreadful. Blessed are the merciful. Not in the sense that we need to become more merciful to achieve God's blessing. We are blessed because we've chosen to follow Jesus. And a part of responding the call to follow Jesus is to renounce our own dignity, to set aside the rights and the privileges that we think we have, and to move into other people's neighborhoods, to identify with them, to walk with them, to serve them, to love them. And yes, this includes the broken. This includes the hurting. This includes the most sinful and despised people of our society. We move into their neighborhood because that's exactly what Jesus Christ did for us. The question is, as we look around, and we look around at the people in our circles, and we look around at the world around us today, whom do we need to identify with? Whom do we need to enter into their world and move into their neighborhood? Because that's a part of what it means to follow Jesus Christ. Pray that you'd continue this Bonhoeffer devotional over the weekend, and I also pray that you'll join us again on Sunday morning as we continue our series in the Gospel of John. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you Sunday.